Hello and welcome to our Bible study for Sunday, July 24th, 2022. We're continuing to look at going through church history, and the one that defines the 11th century question that defines the 11th century is, should Christians fight Muslims over the Holy Land? So we're talking about the Crusades. And we'll start with, of course, hymns then about Jerusalem. Jerusalem the golden, with milk and honey blessed, the promise of salvation, the place of peace and rest. We know not what joys await us there, the radiancy of glory, the bliss beyond compare. Within those walls of Zion sounds forth the joyful song, as saints join with the angels and all the martyred throng. The Prince is ever with them, the daylight is serene, the city of the blessed shines bright with glorious sheen. Around the throne of David, the saints from care released raise loud their songs of triumph to celebrate the feast. They sing to Christ their leader, who conquered in the fight, who won for them forever their gleaming robes of white. O sweet and blessed country, the home of God's elect, O sweet and blessed country that faithful hearts expect. In mercy Jesus brings us to that eternal rest, with you and God the Father and Spirit ever blessed. All right, and so again, we're talking today, of course, about the Crusades, about what should Christians go to the Holy Land to liberate it, and especially this deals with what happens with the city of Jerusalem, which the word Jerusalem it means city of peace, but we see throughout the Bible and throughout world history that it's really not that peaceful of a place. It first appears in Joshua as the Israelites conquer it. David conquers it again and makes it his capital, but then it's besieged and destroyed besieged a few times, destroyed once in the Old Testament and once after the Roman occupation, and that kind of gets us to where we are. But of course, Jerusalem then is also a reminder that it's a holy city for the three main monotheistic religions, the three Abrahamic religions. Of course, for Jews, it's important because of its location of the temple. For Christians, it's important because that's where Jesus died and rose again, and for Muslims, it's important because of the Dome of the Rock. And so the third holiest site in Islam, after Mecca and Medina, is in Jerusalem. And of course, towards the end of his ministry, Jesus warns his followers of what the destruction that's coming. And Jesus said, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let those who are inside the city depart, and let not those who are out of the country enter it, for these are days of vengeance to fulfill all that is written. Alas for women who are pregnant, and for those days who are nursing infants in those days, for there will be great distress upon the earth and wrath against this people. They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And so again, here we're getting Jesus talking before his crucifixion, but he's looking ahead 37 years-ish, almost 40 years to when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in 70 A.D. And actually, the early Christians follow Jesus' command here and are able to flee Jerusalem and go hide elsewhere, and so they don't get caught up in the sea. So Jerusalem, of course, then is important not only for its physical location, for its religious location, but then for the medieval Christians, they're understanding Jerusalem kind of in this fourfold sense of what it means. Some of which we still kind of do today. But if we talk about this fourfold allegorical sense that some of that interpretation was kind of in vogue around this time. So Jerusalem's, in its literal sense, the holy city. In its allegorical sense, it's referred to, when you talk about Jerusalem, it's the church militant, so the church on earth. And of course, so that language, church militant, we'll come back to in a bit. Tropologically, it stands for the just soul, so morally, if we're talking about Jerusalem, we're talking about a person's righteous soul. And then finally, it also stands for the Church Triumphant. We get that, of course, from Revelation, where we get all these pictures of of the Church Triumphant, of the church that's no longer on earth, and how New Jerusalem is the culmination of everything that we're looking to. And so again, this is all just kind of explaining why Jerusalem's important, has been important for centuries for all these religious groups. But then, of course, now we'll dig in a little bit as to why it was important, especially important at this time, and why it's kind of the trigger for, or one of the triggers for what's going on with the Crusades. Now again, remember, Pastor Mark talked a few weeks ago about the expansion of Islam and what happens there. And Muslim forces capture Jerusalem in 638 AD. Otherwise, it had been under the rule of Christians, especially Byzantine Christians, connected there. And it remains under Muslim control after that. Remember here, Muhammad and his forces, they start out down here in Mecca and Medina, and they do a bunch of other conquering, and then again his Hajj 620, and conquers Mecca in 630, but here they get in Jerusalem 636, 639, 630 in this area, and so Muslim power expands, into middle, Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, that area, into Egypt, into modern day Iraq and Iran, the rest of the Arabian Peninsula, and so on and so forth. But even though, of course, it's under Muslim control, that doesn't mean it's under unified control. We've talked a few times about all the different things that are going on. You can kind of see a little bit here, just looking at all the different groups ruling that were around this time. And don't even see here the Roman Empire. You've got the Byzantine Empire here, but you've got the Frankish Empire up here at this time, but you've got all sorts of little states and what we call barbarian peoples around here. But also then, of course, here note there's a few different Muslim groups there too. So by this point there's three major Muslim empires. The Umayyads controlled more territory, had controlled a lot of territory, but civil war made that they're in Spain, which of course things mean we don't usually think of Spain as being a Muslim power, but it for a good portion of the Middle Ages here, it was controlled by them. And so here's another kind of more inset map of what the Caliphate, so these Muslim empires, the areas that they controlled. So you see Spain, what we call Spain, North Africa, Egypt, Arabia, Iraq, Persia, Iran, and some of this other stuff getting closer to India and the stands in modern day Russia and stuff. And so there's the Umayyads, there's the Abbasids, who are based in Baghdad. They're in control during this so-called Golden Age of Islam from the 8th to 14th century. But that ends with the Mongol destruction of Baghdad in 1258. Let's go here. So you start getting some Khanate. So the Mongols are going to come in and conquer them. And then so there's the Abbasids, so this is the largest extent of their control, in about 850, and then the Fatimids are based in Cairo and rule from the Atlantic to the Red Sea, and at this point, then they're in control of Jerusalem, too. So if you note, of course. This area of Jerusalem kind of switches between these Muslim empires, just like it had, in the past between some of the other great powers, between Egypt and Rome and Persia and Babylon and Assyria and all those groups, and so it's switch control and between these different Muslim groups, because these Muslim groups didn't necessarily like each other or get along super well, just like some of the other some of the Christian empires, so to speak, that we've talked about in other times, didn't get along necessarily. But one of the main triggers historians think about the Crusades, though, is this guy named Al-Hakam bin Amir Allah, who lives from about 996 to 1021. He rules from Cairo, Egypt. That's where the Fatimids. So he's based there, and he's known as the Mad Caliph, or the Nero of Islam. If you remember Nero, the Roman emperor, he's the one who kills Peter and Paul. He's the one who fiddles while Rome burns. He's the one who, while looking for a way to pass the blame off from the fires, decides to blame the Christians and uses them as torches. So a very not nice guy, especially to Christians, and so this guy kind of fits that as well. So again, the Jerusalem had been conquered by Muslims in 638, but for the most part, Christians had been able to still visit Jerusalem. Depending on the Muslim group in charge, they were actually fairly tolerant of Christians and Jews in Jerusalem. There's times that they'd have heavy taxes if they didn't convert, if they weren't Muslim, but otherwise they knew the trade and stuff that was coming through was important, so they kind of agreed there. But this guy, this Mad Caliph, decides, he orders the complete destruction. So in 1009, orders the complete destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre as a part of a more general campaign against Christian places of worship in Palestine and Egypt. So he decides to destroy a bunch of Christian holy places because he's Muslim, thinks these Christians need to be gotten rid of, including the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. If you remember, that's founded by Emperor Constantine's mother, based on where people think that the tomb that Jesus used was. So he destroys that, and you can imagine that kind of led to some tension. Of course, it's rebuilt as about 40 years later, as part of an agreement between the Fatimids, between that Muslim group and the Byzantine Empire. Again, the Mad Caliph didn't live for very long, but then, even though it's rebuilt, there's still now this concern about Muslim control of Jerusalem and what it potentially means for Christian access to Jerusalem, for the Christian holy places that are in Jerusalem. And so people are starting to think about this kind of stuff, wondering what they can do about it. But then, even though it's rebuilt in 1048, then the great Seljuk Empire conquers Jerusalem in 1073, and while they don't destroy things, they still limit Christian pilgrims. And then this is how much room they take. They control at the extent of their power. This great Seljuk Empire, again, kind of based in modern-day Iran. Conquered to the east and to the west over here in Jerusalem. And then note here, though, they're getting very close to, this is, modern, they've got control of a lot of modern-day Turkey, including here up to the straits here, which is where Constantinople, or Byzantium is, capital of Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, and so they're getting worried. So then this threatens the Byzantine Empire, and envoys get sent to Pope Urban II in 1095 AD. Pope Urban's still in Rome. Again, Rome and the Roman Empire had fallen, but the Byzantine Empire, which actually would consider itself still Roman, was still in power. And relationships between the two groups had gotten tense. We even hear just past the Great Schism, where there'd been condemnations on both sides over some of the theological disagreements that had come up over the centuries. The big one that is easy to note is in the Nicene Creed, we say that the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. In the East, they just say the Spirit proceeds from the Father, not the Son. And so dealing with that disagreements like that, and plus you've got people dealing with different languages. That the Byzantine Eastern churches are using Greek still for the most part, and the Western churches are using Latin, and so you're starting to get some translation nuances influencing the disagreements too. But in any case, they're desperate enough, they send envoys to Pope Urban in 1095. And Pope Urban II then at the Council of Clermont gives a speech that leads to this, what we now know as the First Crusade. And so here's an excerpt from it. There's apparently some debate over his exact wording. There's like 5 or 6 different sources that don't all agree what he said, but they kind of mostly agree on the overarching thing of it. So here's part of his speech that leads to the crusade. So freshly quickened by the divine correction, you must apply the strength of your righteousness to another matter, which concerns you as well as God. For your brethren who live in the East are in urgent need of your help, and you must hasten to give them the aid which has often been promised to them. For as most of you have heard, the Turks and Arabs have attacked them. They've occupied more and more of the lands of those Christians and have overcome them in 7 battles. They have killed and captured many and destroyed the churches and devastated the empire. If you permit them to continue thus for a while with impurity, the faithful of God will be much more widely attacked by them. On this account I, or rather the Lord, beseech you as Christ's heralds to publish this everywhere and to persuade all people of whatever rank, foot soldiers and knights, poor and rich, to carry aid promptly to those Christians and to destroy that vile race from the lands of our friends. I say this for those who are present, that it meant also for those who are absent. Moreover, Christ commands it. All who die by the way, whether by land or sea or in battle against the pagans, shall have immediate remission of sins. This I grant them through the power of God with which I am invested. And the crowd shouts, Deus lo vult, God wills it. And so this is supposed to be one of the most influential speeches of the Middle Ages, because it gets people to start this First Crusade. And you see there's this political aspect, but also very much a religious aspect of that you're going to protect your fellow Christians. That's why we need to go. Plus, if you die on the way, you get instant remission of sins. We'll circle back to that towards the end. But of course, Pope Urban II isn't necessarily doing this in a vacuum either. The previous pope had tried to get things going and hadn't, but he'd quoted a couple of Bible passages in his trying to do things. He's, of course, 1 John 3:16, not John 3:16, the Gospel in a nutshell. 1 John, by this we know love, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers. So that's talking about how Jesus died for us, served his disciples, and so we're supposed to serve others, lay down our lives. But this got twisted into referred to a military context of go fight, lay down your lives for your brothers who are trapped under this Muslim occupation. Previous pope also cited Jeremiah 48:10, which was one of those passages talking about some of the infidels, some of the opposing nations that are threatening Israel. That cursed is he who does the work of the Lord with slackness, and cursed is he who keeps back his sword from bloodshed. So you need to go and kill these people. So all this stuff works together for this calling of the crusade. Now, of course, they try and get something organized, but this riles people up and gets some people moving first. So we first get the People's Crusade led by Peter the Hermit. It's a poorly armed movement of lower class pilgrims that travel from all over Europe trying to go get to Jerusalem. But of course, on the way, they massacre Jews in Central Europe, pillage the countryside. When they're unable to get provisions in cities, they try and stop and say, "Hey, we need some food and supplies so we can keep going on this crusade." And the cities go, "Why would we do that for you?" And then over time, Peter the Hermit, who seems to be at least doing this there's of course some debate over it, but Peter the Hermit seems to be at least be doing this out of some sort of holy idealism. But the French knights who are with him end up taking command, taking control. They're urged to wait for the main army. Once they get to Constantinople, but they continue anyway. But then are ambushed by Turks on the road to Nicaea, and most of them are killed because they're a poorly armed band of peasants who have no military training. All right, so this is kind of what some of what they do, and this is some of the path then of the rest of the Crusaders once they get there. So we kind of, again, Constantinople's over here in Europe, and then what we call modern day Turkey. That used to be Byzantium. See, even here, we're talking about Nicaea. Was suburb enough of Constantinople that's where the Council of Nicaea was held. And now it's been conquered by the Turks. But then and that's where the People's Crusade gets that far and then gets butchered. And then the rest of the Crusade, once the actual soldiers come and get there, they have a better time of it. They assist in capturing Nicaea, restoring much of western Anatolia to the Byzantine Empire. So this kind of area in purple there. Then the Crusaders, they do make it, and they capture Jerusalem and establish the Crusader States in 1099 after a brutal siege of Jerusalem. And so here they are rejoicing. The Crusaders are rejoicing that they've reconquered Jerusalem, but look at all those they've killed that are at their feet. And so this First Crusade, in terms of some of that, is actually somewhat successful. The Christians decide they needed to recapture Jerusalem in order to protect it. They do so. Great. Well, so not only do you have all these issues from all these challenges from how they did it. Of course, talked about the People's Crusade, killing Jews and rampaging through the countryside, and other groups too. But then you get what happened, and there was slaughter in Jerusalem that didn't necessarily need to be there. But then, of course, this leads to more instability because most of the Crusaders then return home, but some remain to found these what we call the Crusader States. And so this is what you end up kind of having in the time afterwards. Here's a couple. So between the First and Second Crusades, this is what these Crusaders, what states and things look like. So the Byzantine Empire controls this area in purple. So some of the coasts, but not. They've lost most of Turkey to the Seljuk Sultanate. Armenian Sicily, they've got this area. Edessa's a Crusader state. Aleppo's a Crusader state. Tripoli is a Crusader state. And Jerusalem's a Crusader state. But then you've still got the Fatimid Caliphate here kind of down in Egypt, and more of the Great Seljuk Empire here in modern day Iraq and such. But then that's 55 years later, kind of the impetus for the Third Crusade is that Jerusalem falls again, because just like mentioned with all the different Muslim groups and how there was infighting there. There was infighting, among all the Crusader states as well. Different succession crises that happened over who's especially controlling Jerusalem. You got all these French knights full of pride who want to say, "I'm in control," that kind of thing. And so Jerusalem's captured in 1190 over here. You can see how much territory gets lost. The Armenian Sicily has expanded a little. Byzantine Empire's shrunk a little. There's still a Principality of Antioch. There's still a County of Tripoli. They still have control of Tyre. But all the rest of this is under the domain of Saladin, he's actually a Kurd from what we call modern day northern Iraq, but he ends up going to Egypt and ends up being able to take control there. and he's a brilliant general and is able to conquer all of this area. All right, so again, Jerusalem falls again on October 2nd, 1187, so the Crusaders remain in control of Jerusalem for about little under 100 years, 90 years. After, again, infighting weakens leadership and Saladin gains control of the Muslim forces, he's able to take control enough and be able to unite the Muslim forces against the Crusaders, because part of why the Crusaders won was because the Muslims were not united. All right, so then that leads to Jerusalem falls in 1187. Third Crusade, I didn't mention the second, but and we'll kind of try and touch on some of the rest of the Crusades, just to give some idea. Third Crusade is led by Richard the Lionheart, and he succeeds in restoring access to Jerusalem for Christians. He's the one, of course, later gets linked with Robin Hood stories. But despite, in the Robin Hood stories, he always seems to be this great, wonderful king. He was really seemed to have been a pretty bad one. He's only in England to rule for about 6 months. Then he's off crusading. He gets captured on his way back, and the ransom, bankrupts things, that kind of stuff. So it's a big mess for him. But he did at least succeed in restoring access to Jerusalem for the Crusaders. But it doesn't succeed enough, so there's a Fourth Crusade, but they don't get all the way to the Holy Land. They make it as far as Constantinople of Byzantium, because they'd been promised support, and then the political infighting in Constantinople happened, and the new guy wasn't going to keep the promises of the old guy, and so the Crusaders go, well, if you're not going to give us stuff, we'll just sack the city and take what we think we earned by force. So it results in the sack of Constantinople. That, of course, weakens the Byzantine Empire and solidify the East-West Christian split. Because, Crusaders were Christians, we're going to go fight, the infidel pagan Muslims against these, but instead they sack Constantinople, sack Byzantium, where the Eastern Orthodox churches are. So they sack Jerusalem, Constantinople, which doesn't earn them a whole lot of things. And then the later Crusades were generally failures. There's debate about lots of them, but in general, the Crusade historians date the last end of the crusading period to about 1291, with the fall of Acre and the rise of the Ottoman Empire. Let me go back to the map here. So Acre, here is port near Jerusalem, so that's where if they actually could afford ships and come by ships, that's where they came, and so that falls in 1291, and so that's when the Crusaders fall. And then the Ottoman Empire takes control of modern-day Turkey, so the land routes close too. And so the crusading period is generally over from that point on. We talk generally when you think of Crusades, you think about these Crusades to the Holy Land. There were some other Crusades called, so to speak, some against. We mentioned earlier there was Muslim control of Spain, so there were Crusades called there, and that ends up that lasts until the Spanish the Moors drive the Muslims out of Spain. In 1492, by Ferdinand and Isabella. You might have heard of them from some other times, some other events that they did in 1492 as well. But then, so how do we understand the Crusades? How do we respond to that? What's the historical record? Well, Luther doesn't like them for a lot of reasons. Part of which is that it was with indulgences and crusade taxes, he writes, that Christians have been stirred up to take sword and fight the Turk, when they ought to have been fighting the devil and unbelief with the word and with prayer. And so that's Martin Luther writing in 1529 in his work called On the War Against the Turk. Again, the Turks are at the gate of Vienna, and that they're trying to do it. And so for Luther, part of the challenge with the Crusades are twofold. One, that the Christian life, the Christian struggle should be more focused inward on the inward spiritual battle than not necessarily on some outward military battle. Jesus takes up his cross. He doesn't takes up his cross to die, not takes up his cross to, as in, which is how the Crusaders sometimes describe themselves, taking up the cross as in they'd put a cross on their shield and armor and then go and try and go and fight these battles. But of course, also, like Luther's other problems with the Catholic Church, comes down to money. That he saw that how were these crusades paid for? At least part of it led to why there's indulgences going on at Luther's time. Not only that, what Pope Urban said of, if you die on this crusade, you get remission of sins, taking that all away from Christ, but the idea of, that you buy indulgences to get forgiveness of sins, and that's part of how the papacy paid for the crusades. And of course, in Luther's time, they're using that to pay for building St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. So that's a big part of it. So Luther's generally against them, and that tends to be with the rest of the reformers too. As we get closer to our own day, we see things happen. In Eisenhower's letter on memo on D-Day, he tells the soldiers, "You're about to embark on the Great Crusade, towards which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle." So he calls this the Great Crusade against the fascist forces, against Nazis, to restore Europe. And of course, and that's taken actually, in a very positive way. But then, fast forward 60 years, and Bush got a lot of pushback when he started talking about this crusade, this war on terrorism is going to take a while in the aftermath of September 11th. Those attacks, he talking about that as a crusade. And of course, the context is slightly different, but that you're definitely referring back to, or evoking that memory of the Europeans, of white Christians attacking Muslim states with the Crusades, in the aftermath of 9/11. And so there was a lot of pushback there, and so, the military names tended to, the initial proposals tended to have crusade-y kind of words in it, and then didn't. And so it all kind of leads into this idea that, historian Karen Armstrong says in her book Fields of Blood, that in the West the idea that religion is inherently violent is now taken for granted and seems self-evident. And of course, it's not just Christians that covers now. Of course, we just mentioned September 11th. So we've got, the Muslims and their idea of jihad, of struggle, which ideally is more of that internal struggle against sin, and not this holy war where if you die in battle, you automatically get to heaven and get 70 virgins and things. But as the West gets more secular and more suspicious of religion in general, that's part of why they can, and they'll point back to these crusades as one of the big justifications. Of course, all wars were caused by religion. Look at the Crusades, or look at, and we'll maybe touch on this in a later one, the later segment, the idea, the so-called wars of religion of the 1600s, 30 Years' War, where it's these Protestant and Catholic powers against each other, using religion as justification for how they're fighting. So all of this leads to the idea of religion being seen as violent. And so now, even though crusades were sometimes held as in somewhat of a more popular view, or positive way, they're definitely seen as much more negative today. My alma mater, Valparaiso University, the mascot was the Crusader. The Crusader was picked in the 40s. Before then, since a bunch of Lutherans had bought Valpo in the 20s, they used a German horse soldier as the mascot. That didn't go over too well during World War II, though, so they switched to the Crusader. But now they've switched to the beacons. In 2021, there'd been efforts to get away from Crusaders over the last 20 or so years, and so during the presidential change, the interim president's the one who got rid of Crusaders, and then the current president's the one who led the committee that got beacons. So again, less violent imagery there, and a lot of other religious schools have been shifting away from using Crusader as their mascot as well. One of the groups we sometimes work with here on campus, Campus Crusade for Christ, or CRU, or if you're old enough to remember, the Billy Graham Crusades kind of thing. But CRU changed their name in 2011 to just CRU instead of officially Campus Crusade for Christ, just to avoid that, especially because they're working both in their work with international students in the States, but also they sponsor international missionaries in different countries, and so Crusade in those other countries especially would be a huge roadblock for people becoming Christian, because why would that be associated with the Crusade? And so they switched to that as well. All right, so what can we learn from this? Well, kind of again that reminder of how easy it is for us to look and try and use religion, use Christianity, use our beliefs to not to change ourselves, but instead to use them to justify what we already want to do. How it can be used to justify horrible things. How it can be used to motivate people to do both good and bad things. How when we're involved in war, as a country, we need to look and make sure that we're doing so in a respectful way out of the Crusades. There'd been moved early on, but the theologians developed some ideas of just war theories in terms of what makes a war just, what makes it morally acceptable to do that kind of thing. In the Reformation, you had some groups that became purely pacifist. Luther wrote a tract on saying that yes, you may be a soldier, but following lawful orders and that kind of thing. And so again, just kind of that reminder of too that as Christians we have things in our history that we need to be mindful of, that we need to repent of, that we need to realize that didn't put Christians in the best light, and wondering how to and looking and finding more ways on how we can kind of overcome that history and become the better followers of Christ, which we will once we're perfected and with God in that new Jerusalem. So we'll end with looking at the hymn, Jerusalem, my happy home. Jerusalem, my happy home, when shall I come to thee? When shall my sorrows have an end? Thy joys when shall I see? O happy harbor of the saints, O sweet and pleasant soil, in thee no sorrow may be found, no grief, no care, no toil. Thy gardens and thy gallant walk continually are green. There grow such sweet and pleasant flowers as nowhere else are seen. Their trees forevermore bear fruit, and evermore do spring. There evermore the angels dwell, and evermore do sing. Apostles, martyrs, prophets there around my Savior stand, and soon my friends in Christ below will join the glorious band. O Christ, do thou my soul prepare for that bright home of love, that I may see thee and adore with all thy saints above. Thank you very much for watching and listening.